The most powerful stories often come from those who remain nameless. We give a voice to the anonymous and a face to the forgotten in our latest series of emotional dramas. Subscribe today and help us tell the stories that matter. The day my husband looked me in the eyes across the hospital bed and said, "That baby isn't mine, and I want nothing to do with either of you," I thought the world had stopped spinning. I had just spent 19 hours in labor. My hands were still shaking. And Daniel Mitchell, the man I had built 5 years of my life around, turned and walked out of that delivery room without once looking back. 20 years later, he stood in the hallway of the same hospital, this time as a patient. And the young doctor holding his chart, the one the nurses kept calling brilliant, the one who would decide whether my husband lived or died, was our son. I want to tell you everything. Because the truth is so much stranger than anything I could have invented. My name is Sarah, and I was 28 years old the morning Ethan came into the world. Daniel and I had been married for 3 years by then. We met at an architecture firm in Boston where I was a junior designer and he was the golden boy, charming, ambitious, and impossibly sure of himself. His family owned Mitchell Properties, one of the largest real estate development companies in New England. His father, Robert Mitchell, ran the company like a feudal lord. And Daniel had grown up learning that power was something you protected, not something you shared. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. Robert never liked me. He was polite in the way that rich men are polite when they've already decided you don't belong. Careful, correct, and completely cold. He called me Sarah while he called every other woman in Daniel's life by a nickname. He asked about my family background at our first dinner together with the precision of someone conducting a background check. Daniel always laughed it off. "That's just Dad," he'd say. He's old school. When I got pregnant, Daniel seemed genuinely happy. We painted the nursery together. He drove me to every prenatal appointment. He held my hand and said, "I can't wait to meet him," when the ultrasound confirmed we were having a boy. Then, somewhere around my 6th month, everything changed. Daniel started working late. He became distant, then distracted, then cold in a way that didn't feel like stress. It felt like decision. When I asked what was wrong, he said nothing. When I pressed, he left the room. The last 2 months of my pregnancy, I cried more than I slept. I told myself it was nerves. New father anxiety. The weight of the family business. I told myself every story except the true one, because I wasn't ready to know it yet. The morning my water broke, Daniel drove me to the hospital in silence. He sat beside me during labor, but he didn't hold my hand. He looked at his phone. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at everything except me. Ethan was born at 6'12" the morning, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry so fierce the nurses laughed. The doctor placed him in my arms and I felt something rearrange itself permanently inside my chest. I looked up at Daniel expecting to see the same thing reflected on his face. What I saw instead was a man who had already made up his mind. He stood by the window with his arms crossed. His jaw was tight. He looked at our son the way you look at evidence of something you didn't want proven. "We need to talk," he said. "Daniel." The paternity test came back. I didn't understand at first. I hadn't known there was a paternity test. I hadn't agreed to one, hadn't been asked, hadn't been told. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the bed beside me. I couldn't read it. My eyes wouldn't focus. I was holding a 6-minute-old baby and my husband was standing by the window like a stranger. "The results say he isn't mine," Daniel said. His voice was flat. "Practiced. Like he'd rehearsed this. I don't know what you did or who you were with, but I'm not raising another man's child. My lawyer will be in touch." He walked out. He didn't touch Ethan. He didn't say goodbye. He just left, and the sound of that door closing behind him is something I have never fully stopped hearing. I lay there while the nurses moved quietly around me, pretending not to have heard. My best friend, a woman named Carol who had driven through the night when I'd texted her that something felt wrong, arrived an hour later and found me still sitting in exactly the same position, Ethan asleep against my chest. The paper Daniel had left still folded on the bed beside me. She picked it up. She read it. She sat down and took my hand. "This doesn't make sense," she said. It didn't. Because there had never been an affair. There had never been a question. Daniel and I had been together, faithfully, for 5 years. I had never touched another man. I had never wanted to. But I was holding a newborn and the walls were closing in and I didn't have the strength to fight anything yet. So I did the only thing I could do. I looked down at my son, at his perfect sleeping face, and I made him a quiet promise. Whatever the truth turned out to be, whatever Daniel believed, whatever Robert Mitchell had planned, because even then, somewhere beneath the shock, I knew Robert's fingerprints were on this. I would not break. Not in front of this child. Not ever. The divorce papers arrived before I was discharged. Daniel had been prepared. His lawyers were thorough. He wanted no custody. No contact. No claim. He signed away our son without a second thought. There was a check inside the envelope, a number that was meant to feel generous and instead felt like an insult wrapped in zeros. I put the check in a drawer and left it there. I didn't touch it for 20 years. My mother came from Ohio to help those first weeks. Carol came every day. We set up in my apartment, 2 women and a newborn, figuring out each 12-hour stretch one feeding at a time. I applied for jobs from my laptop while Ethan slept on my chest in a carrier. I took a position with a small architecture firm that allowed remote work. I learned to function on broken sleep and cold coffee and the specific determination that comes from having no alternative. Ethan grew. He grew fast and he grew curious and he grew, above everything else, kind. By the time he was 2, he was the child who stopped on the sidewalk to make sure the worm got off the hot pavement. By the time he was 5, his preschool teacher pulled me aside to tell me he had spent his recess helping a younger child who had fallen and was too embarrassed to cry in front of the others. He's going to do something important with his life, she said. I believed her. I told Ethan about his father when he was 7. I sat with him at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, a plate of untouched grilled cheese between us. And I told him as much truth as a 7-year-old could hold. His father had believed something that wasn't true. His father had left because of that belief. It wasn't Ethan's fault. It had never been Ethan's fault. He was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his sandwich and took a bite. Did you ever try to tell him he was wrong? He asked. I tried, I said. He didn't want to listen. Ethan chewed slowly. Some people are scared of being wrong, he said. My teacher says it's because being wrong feels like being bad. But they're different things. I looked at my 7-year-old son and thought, how did I make you? We built a life that looked nothing like the one I had imagined and turned out to be better than I had deserved. I made partner at the firm by the time Ethan was in middle school. We moved to a 2-bedroom house with a yard in a quiet neighborhood outside Boston. Carol's kids and Ethan grew up like cousins. My mother visited every Christmas and stayed too long, and we loved every minute of it. Daniel and his family existed at a remove, like weather in another city. I knew he had remarried a woman from his father's social circle, exactly the type Robert had always wanted for him. I knew Mitchell Properties had expanded, that Robert still ran it with an iron grip even as Daniel nominally took over more responsibility. I knew these things the way you know things about a country you once visited and decided not to return to. I did not know, until Ethan was 16, that the paternity test Daniel had presented me in that hospital room had been falsified. I found out the way you find out things you weren't supposed to know. By accident. By someone else's mistake. I was at a medical conference with Ethan. He had become obsessed with science by then, already talking about medicine, already volunteering at the hospital on weekends when a man approached me at the registration table. He was older, gray-haired, with the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was tired. His name was Frank. He had worked for a private laboratory in Boston for 15 years. He had retired the previous spring. He said, "Mrs. Mitchell?" I said, "I haven't used that name in 16 years. He said, "I know. I'm sorry. I've been trying to find the right time to do this for a long time, and I don't think the right time is ever going to come. So I'm just going to do it now." He told me that in the spring before Ethan was born, he had been employed to run a paternity test on a DNA sample and a reference sample provided to him by a private contractor. He had been well paid to produce a specific result regardless of what the actual science showed. He had been a younger man, in debt, with a sick wife, and he had told himself it was a civil matter, not a criminal one, and that the people involved were wealthy enough that no one would actually get hurt. He had been wrong. He had known he was wrong for 16 years. And when he saw my name on the conference registration list, I had hyphenated back to my maiden name. Ethan had always gone by Holloway, my name. He had decided that the right thing to do, even late, was still the right thing. Robert Mitchell had ordered the test. Robert Mitchell had paid for the result. Daniel had never known the test was rigged. He had been given a document by his father, told it was the truth, and had believed it because he had been raised by a man who taught him that paternal authority was the same thing as fact. I sat with this information for 3 days before I told anyone. I sat with it the way you sit with something that rewrites the past without changing the present. Ethan was 16. He was healthy, loved, thriving. He had a mother, a community, a direction. What he did not have was a father, and no document was going to give him one retroactively. But he deserved the truth. And so, eventually, did Daniel. I told Carol first. She said approximately 12 things I won't repeat here, and then she made tea and we sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours talking through what to do. I told Ethan on a Sunday. We were cooking dinner together, his current favorite, chicken soup from scratch, and I turned down the heat on the stove and said, "There's something I found out this week that you need to know." He listened. He didn't interrupt. He stood with a wooden spoon in his hand and listened to everything, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "So Grandfather Robert paid someone to lie," he said finally. "Yes." And Dad believed him. "Yes." Did Dad know the test was fake? "No. I don't believe he did." Ethan turned back to the stove and stirred the soup. His shoulders were tight. Then they loosened. "I'm not sure that makes it better," he said. "But it makes it different. We didn't contact Daniel or Robert that year. Ethan asked me to wait. He was 16, he said, and he needed time to decide what he wanted from this information before anyone else knew he had it. I respected that. I had spent his entire life trying to give him agency over the parts of his story that belonged to him. He spent those 2 years doing what he always did with hard things. He studied them. He researched the legal and ethical dimensions. He talked to Carol's husband, who was a family law attorney. He talked to his school counselor. He ran his own independent DNA test using a commercial kit, requesting comparison data from publicly available Mitchell family genealogy records. Robert Mitchell had apparently participated in an ancestry database years ago, never imagining the information could be used this way. The results were unambiguous. Ethan Mitchell Holloway was exactly who he had always been. He graduated high school with the highest GPA in his class. He was accepted to Johns Hopkins on a full scholarship. He chose medicine. He told me the night of his acceptance, sitting on the back porch in the dark, "I want to understand how things work from the inside. Bodies, systems. What goes wrong and why and how you fix it. I think I've always wanted that." I looked at him, 18 years old, 6 feet tall, his dark hair still falling over his forehead the way it had since he was 2, and thought about the man who had left a hospital room rather than claim him. His loss had always been the greater one. He just hadn't known it yet. Ethan finished his undergraduate degree in 3 years. He went directly into a combined MD-PhD program with a focus on hepatology and transplant medicine. He published research as a second-year resident that was cited in 3 major journals. His colleagues called him methodical and his patients called him kind. And those 2 things together, I had always believed, were the highest form of medical intelligence. He called me every Sunday. We talked for an hour, sometimes 2. He told me about cases, about hospital politics, about the residents he was supervising and the attendings he was learning from, and the impossible weight of other people's lives held in your hands. He never talked about his father. He hadn't yet decided what to do with what he knew, and I had long since stopped trying to decide for him. Then, in January of the year Ethan turned 28, his residency program director called to let him know that a patient had requested him specifically. The patient had read about Ethan's research in a magazine profile. He needed a liver transplant, a complex case, and he had asked whether Dr. Holloway would take it. The patient's name was Daniel Mitchell. Ethan called me that night. His voice was very calm. He said, "I need you to know before I decide anything. Because it involves you too." I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, it was snowing. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to treat him," Ethan said. "Not because he's my father. Not for closure or confrontation or any of those things. Because he's sick and it's what I trained to do, and I'm apparently one of the best people in this region to help him. I don't want to let who he is change what I do." I thought about a 7-year-old boy explaining the difference between being wrong and being bad. "Then that's what you should do," I said. He paused. "Will you come?" I hadn't seen Daniel Mitchell in 28 years. I had not planned to. But my son was asking, and I understood why. Not for the drama of it, not for any kind of reckoning. Ethan had never been interested in those things. He was asking because confronting something alone when you don't have to is just unnecessary suffering, and we had always tried, the two of us, to be useful to each other. Yes, I said. I'll come. I drove to Boston on a Tuesday in February. Ethan met me in the hospital lobby. He was in his white coat, taller than I remembered somehow, which wasn't logical, but there it was. He hugged me and said, "He doesn't know yet. About me, I mean. About who I am. When are you going to tell him?" "After he's stable," Ethan said. "After the evaluation. When he can hear it properly." Daniel was in a private room on the 4th floor. I waited in the hallway while Ethan went in to introduce himself. I could hear their voices, not the words, just the cadence. Then Ethan came back out and said, quietly, "He wants to meet you." I was not prepared for how much he had aged. I knew 28 years had passed. I knew the math. But the man sitting up in the hospital bed was gray and thin and wore the careful stillness of someone who had been frightened long enough to stop fighting it. He looked at me and something crossed his face, recognition, then something harder to name. "Sarah," he said. "Danielle." He looked at my son. At Ethan in his white coat with his chart and his steady eyes and his face that was, unmistakably to anyone paying attention, a version of Daniel's own. "He's mine," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. He said, "My father told me." "I know what your father told you." "I should have." "Yes," I said. "You should have." There was a long silence. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, watching his father with the particular attention of a physician who is also something else entirely. Daniel looked at his son. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough." "It isn't," Ethan said. "But it's a start." He pulled up a chair. "Now I need to talk to you about your liver panel, because we have some decisions to make and not a lot of time to make them." I watched my son take his father through the medical reality of his condition methodically, clearly, without cruelty but without softening what needed to be understood. I watched Daniel listen. I watched something shift in the room, nothing dramatic, nothing resolved, just two people beginning to exist in the same space for the first time. Later, in the hallway, Ethan asked me what I was thinking. I said, "I'm thinking you're going to be fine." "I know," he said. I meant about him. I thought about it honestly. I'm thinking that some people spend their whole lives letting someone else's fear make their decisions for them. And they don't understand what they've lost until it's almost too late. Ethan nodded slowly. "Robert came to see him last week," he said. "Dad told him not to come back. That was before he knew about the test. He'd found out some other way, apparently. I don't know the details yet. I didn't ask for them. Whatever accounting Robert Mitchell had coming, it had nothing to do with me anymore. My business with that family had always been only about Ethan, and Ethan had handled himself with more grace than the situation deserved. Robert Mitchell died 4 months later, a stroke, before any legal proceedings could be formally pursued. There had been a brief period when Carol's husband had drawn up the papers, when there had been talk of pursuing a fraud case, but Ethan had said, quietly, that he didn't want to spend his energy on destruction. He had a career to build and patients who needed him and one careful, complicated new relationship with a father who was sick and trying and running out of time. Daniel survived the surgery. Ethan was not his primary surgeon. Ethics required recusal, and Ethan understood that without being told, but he was present, and he was the physician who managed Daniel's recovery, and he was there the morning his father sat up in bed and said, for the first time, "Tell me about yourself." Everything. From the beginning. It took 3 visits to get through it all. Ethan was measured. He wasn't trying to punish and he wasn't trying to rush. He shared what he wanted to share, kept what he wanted to keep, and approached his father with the same careful curiosity he brought to everything, trying to understand how this particular system had failed, and why, and what could be salvaged from the wreckage. I wasn't there for most of those conversations. That was right. That was how it should be. This part of the story was Ethan's to write. What I know is that Daniel came to Boston for Ethan's attending promotion ceremony that spring. He sat 2 rows behind me, and he didn't speak to me until it was over, and then he found me in the lobby with Carol and he said, "Thank you for raising him the way you did." "He's the best person I've ever met." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry I made you do it alone." I had thought, over the years, about what I would say if this moment ever came. I had imagined versions of it, angry versions and cold versions and noble versions. But standing there in the lobby of a hospital in Boston while my son accepted congratulations across the room, I found I didn't want any of those versions. I said, "We weren't alone, we had each other." He nodded. He looked like he understood how much that cost him. The last thing I want to tell you is this. A few months ago, Ethan and I were having Sunday dinner at my house, the chicken soup we've been making together since he was a teenager, and he said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "I've been thinking that for a long time I defined myself partly by his absence. Not consciously, not in a way that made me angry, but it shaped things. The way I thought about reliability, about showing up, about what love actually looks like in practice." He was quiet for a moment, stirring the soup the way he always does, slow circles. "And I think that's okay," he said. "I think the things that shape us don't have to be either good or bad. They're just the material we had to work with." I looked at my son, who was 30 years old and a physician and the best person I'd ever made with my hands and my time and everything I had. And I thought about a man walking out of a hospital room 28 years ago, thinking he was leaving behind a problem. He had left behind the solution to one. The soup was ready. We sat down and ate it together, and outside the window, the afternoon was going gold the way it does in late October, and I thought that this ordinary, peaceful, sufficient evening was everything I had promised him in those first dark hours. Everything I had worked for, without knowing quite what shape it would take. Some things you build in the middle of the worst night of your life. You don't know what they are yet. You just start building. Before you go, if this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to the Masked Links. It's completely free, and it means we can keep bringing you these stories of resilience, truth, and the kind of strength that gets passed down from mother to child. Drop a comment below and tell me, what moment in this story stayed with you?